Vanakkam. Welcome to this video on biomechanics. We have been looking at the biomechanical analysis of the joints of the upper limb. So, in the previous videos we looked at the shoulder joint, elbow joint, etc. So, in this video we will be looking at the wrist joint, the muscles that span the wrist joint and the movements of the wrist joint. So, what is the wrist joint? So, there are these bones in the hand, or the proximal bones of the hand are called as the carpal bones. We saw this trapezium, trapezoid, scaphoid, luneate, hamate, etc. These 8 bones, or some of these carpal bones, form joints with the radius and ulna of the forearm. So, there are 3 joints that come into the picture. The joint of the radius with the carpal bones or the radiocarpal joint, the joint of the ulna with the carpal joint or the ulnocarpal joint, and the distal radio-ulnar joint. Remember, when we looked at the elbow, we looked at the proximal radio-ulnar joint. Here you have the distal joint where the radius and ulna meet once again. This is called as the distal radio-ulnar joint. So, this is an ellipsoid joint. That means that it will have 2 degrees of freedom. Right. So, what are the muscles that span and supply the wrist joint? There are actually quite a few. We will be looking at these one by one, or at least we will be looking at the most important ones. The first of the extensor muscles is the extensor digitorum muscle. It is a superficial muscle and its origin is at the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. Right. So, it is starting in the upper arm and it inserts on the extensor expansions of digits 2 to 5, that is on the index, middle ring, little finger. It is responsible for the extension of the metacarpophalangeal joint of digits 2, 3, 4 and 5, or for the index, middle ring and little fingers is responsible for the extension. Turns out that it is also responsible for extension of the wrist. It is also a wrist extensor. Then we move on to extensor digiti minimi. This is neither a superficial muscle nor a deep muscle. This is an intermediate muscle. This also originates in the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. The insertion is on the dorsal digital expansion of the little finger. It is responsible for extension of the little finger. Actually, for the extension of the MCP joint of index, middle, ring and little fingers, you have the extensor digitorum. Then you have the extensor digiti minimi. Whenever a muscle name is followed by minimi, that means that it is responsible for that action in the little finger. Okay. So, and it turns out that this is also an extensor of the wrist. Then you have the extensor carpi radialis longus, the long extensor carpi radialis. So, this is a superficial muscle. Again, this is anterior lower 1/3 of the lateral supracondylar ridge of the humerus and the adjacent intramuscular septum. So, originates in the upper arm and inserts on the dorsal surface of the second metacarpal. Second metacarpal means responsible for movement of the index finger, right. Extension of the main action is extension of the wrist and abduction of the wrist. Technically this is called radial deviation of the wrist. The other action partly contributes also to the elbow flexion. Okay. Then you have extensor carpi radialis brevis. This is a superficial muscle. This also originates in the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. This inserts on the dorsal surface of the bases of second and third metacarpals. For the first metacarpal, already for the digiti minimi inserts on the little finger, and earlier we saw the longus attaches to the index finger. This one also attaches to the index and middle finger, again responsible for extension and abduction of the wrist. Then you have extensor pollicis brevis. This is a deep muscle. This originates in the lower third of the posterior surface of the radius. So, on the radius, on the thumb side of the forearm, on the lower third of the posterior surface. So, somewhere here is where it originates, right, lower third, and the interosseous membrane, and it inserts on the proximal phalanx of the thumb. So, there are only two phalanges in the thumb. This is the distal phalanx and this is the proximal phalanx. At the base of the proximal phalanx of the thumb is where it attaches. What would be its function? So, when it contracts, it is going to pull the thumb in this direction, right. So, it is going to perform extension of the thumb at the MCP joint and at the CMC joint. Okay. Then you have extensor carpi ulnaris. This is a superficial muscle. It originates again on the lateral epicondyle of the humerus and the posterior aspect of the ulna on the back side. The insertion is on the tubercle on the medial side of the base of the fifth metacarpal. Fifth metacarpal means near the little finger, right. What is the function on the medial side? So, right, the function is extension and adduction of the wrist. Then you have the long muscle abductor pollicis longus. It is a deep muscle. It originates in the posterior surface of the proximal half of the radius, ulna and interosseous membrane. It attaches on the radial side of the base of the first metacarpal. Okay. So, responsible for some movement of the thumb, may be able to immediately guess, because on the radial side of the first metacarpal. Then it is responsible for abduction of the thumb and extension of the CMC joint, the first CMC joint. So, it is responsible for that movement, radial deviation and flexion of the wrist. So, that movement. So, now let us discuss the movements of the wrist. When I say wrist flexion, this is flexion, right. Then you have wrist extension, like that. This is wrist extension. Then what you would normally call in other segments as abduction is called radial deviation, right. That is deviation towards the radius, radial deviation. And what you would call as adduction, adduction is ulnar deviation. Okay. So, these are the movements, predominant movements of the wrist joint. So, with this we come to the end of this video. So, in this video we saw what is the wrist joint, what are these joints, the radiocarpal joint, the ulnocarpal joint and the distal radio-ulnar joint together constitute the wrist joint. the various muscles that supply the wrist joint and the movements of the wrist joint. With this, we come to the end of this video. Thank you very much for your attention.